French President Emmanuel Macron is not just battling extremism and protests, he is also fighting the press, the American press to be precise. Before I tell you more, I want to ask you a question. What is the role of the media? And what do you think is the role of the media during a crisis? To report facts. France has been hit by a series of terror attacks. What do you think the American press is up to? Emmanuel Macron says it is legitimizing terrorism, fanning racism, and is reluctant in expressing solidarity with France. Last week, the French president dialed a New York Times writer. His name is Ben Smith. Macron raised a complaint with Smith about his paper's coverage of the France terror attacks. Smith wrote about the conversation in a piece titled "The President versus the American Media." He writes, and I'm quoting, "So President Emmanuel Macron of France called me on Thursday afternoon from his office to drive home a complaint." Here's what Smith says. Macron told him, I'm quoting again, "So when I see in that context several newspapers which I believe are from countries that share our values, journalists who write in a country that is the heir to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, when I see them legitimizing this violence and saying that the heart of the problem is that France is racist and Islamophobic, then I say the founding principles have been lost," quote unquote. What was Emmanuel Macron referring to? The New York Times questioned the French crackdown on extremism. It asked whether France is fueling Muslim terrorism by trying to prevent it. The New York Times also drew a contrast between Macron's response to the terror attacks versus why Austria responded to terror. Macron's complaint is not just against one paper or one writer. On the 3rd of November, the Financial Times argued that Macron was alienating the majority of Muslims who hate terrorism. The article read, and I'm quoting, "Macron's war on Islamic separatism only divides France further," quote unquote. The article was taken off the internet after complaints from readers and a call from the French president's office. And then there is this piece from the Washington Post. It reads, "Instead of fighting systemic racism, France wants to reform Islam." Macron says that the American media has failed to understand French secularism. Is he wrong? Is the American media getting its narrative wrong? More than 250 people in France have lost their lives to terror since 2015. This is the highest number in any Western country. Is the American press fanning extremism? Is it legitimizing terror? Is it victim shaming? And is it the first time the American media is on to something like this? In 2013, when India launched its Mars mission, the New York Times seemed rather unhappy, and its unhappiness was reflected in this distasteful cartoon of the Mangalyaan. Cut to the 2019 Pulwama attack. New York Times painted India as an aggressor, and Pakistan was shown in the light of a victim. The words used for India were accuses, threatens, strikes, in revenge, quote unquote. As for Pakistan, it used expressions like offers to investigate, serves tea to a pilot. Not for once did the New York Times call out Pakistani terrorists. The newspaper stuck to quote unquote militants. We have spoken about all of this on Gravitas. Let me ask you another question now. Do you think Emmanuel Macron is wrong in calling American press out for its bias? An article on the tablet Mag claims that the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, and the CNN are quote-unquote no more attached to truth than Donald Trump was. Ben Smith has written a piece in the defense of his paper. Let me read out some lines for you now. "Some of the coverage Mr. Macron complains about reflects a genuine difference of values. Picking fights with American media is also an old sport in France, and it can be hard to know when the talk of cultural differences is real and when it is intended to wave away uncomfortable realities." What about India? India has supported France in its fight against terror. And when it comes to calling out the bias of the American press, here too, New Delhi can hold enough and more examples in the face of the American editors.